Glycolysis, respiration, and fermentation. Glycolysis. Glycolysis is a catabolic process which cells perform in order to break down glucose. This reaction produces pyruvic acid and energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Glycolysis is carried out by all cells that perform either respiration or fermentation. Through glycolysis, cells harvest not only energy but electrons and carbon as well. Literally, glycolysis means the breaking down of glucose. Glyco means glucose, and lysis means to break down. The overall process of glycolysis can be divided into 3 distinct steps. The first part of this reaction is the initial breaking down of glucose within the cell. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule that requires energy to be broken apart. The cell contributes 2 molecules of ATP in order to break down this glucose. The addition of the phosphate molecules from the adenosine triphosphate on the 6-carbon glucose breaks it down into a 6-carbon sugar diphosphate and 2 adenosine diphosphate molecules, or ADP, which is another form of energy used by the cell. This 6-carbon sugar diphosphate is then split into 2 3-carbon sugar phosphate molecules. Through a series of reactions, these molecules are ultimately converted into pyruvic acid. During these reactions, electrons and carbon can be harvested from the cell. The transfer of electrons during this process produces 4 molecules of ATP, which makes the end result of glycolysis a net gain of 2 ATP molecules and 2 3-carbon pyruvic acid molecules. Pyruvate, or pyruvic acid, is toxic to the cell, and in this case acts as the waste molecule left over from the glycolysis reaction. Here is an overall diagram of the glycolysis process, and this shows that the initial glucose, the carbohydrate that we get from food, is used to get 2 ATP molecules, also produces pyruvic acid, which eventually, through either respiration and a little bit through fermentation, will produce even more energy. Respiration. After performing glycolysis, the cell is ready to go through a process called respiration. At the end of glycolysis, the cell forms pyruvic acid, and as a result from the reaction. The first step of respiration is to get rid of this toxic pyruvic acid and convert it into something usable for the cell. Although toxic to the cell, the pyruvic acid is responsible for harvesting electrons that will later be essential in producing mass amounts of ATP. In order to begin this process, the cell transports the pyruvic acid into the Krebs cycle, which combines the pyruvic acid with enzymes that form lots of high-energy electrons and some ATP as well. Next, the electrons produced in the Krebs cycle go into what's called the electron transport system. During the electron transport system, molecules come together to help power ATP synthase, which synthesizes a ton of ATP, which is shown here. So we're going to go back. A more specific form of this process is called aerobic respiration. From the term aerobic, we know this reaction will require oxygen. The main objective of aerobic respiration is to make all this energy that is being produced transportable within the cell. During the electron transport system, the energy formed is not transportable and therefore not useful to the cell. The energy produced in ATP synthase, ATP, is transportable. However, with all the electrons moving through the electron transport system, it can get clogged with an overflow of electrons, which in turn inhibits the production of ATP. So aerobic respiration uses the oxygen we breathe to clear out the used up electrons clogging the electron transport system and resume ATP production. The oxygen that comes in picks up an electron, combines it with a hydrogen molecule, which forms H2O, or water, and carbon dioxide, CO2. These are both waste byproducts that our body can easily expel. This process repeats itself with every electron that travels through the electron transport system, which makes production of transportable ATP possible. So here's all the ATP that is formed from the respiration process. And this is a little overview of the entire respiration process. So you take the pyruvic acid, goes through the Krebs cycle, the electrons that come out of the Krebs cycle through the electron transport system. With oxygen and hydrogen, it's able to form water and carbon dioxide, which is the waste, and then the electrons continue through the ATP synthase and produce mass amounts of ATP that our cell can use as energy. O2 is what the respiration needs to make it possible, and without it our bodies would not be able to make energy and in short survive. From glycolysis, if oxygen is introduced, the cell will grow through respiration. If oxygen is absent, it will go through fermentation. Fermentation is an anaerobic process in which pyruvic acid formed in glycolysis is transformed into organic products such as acid, alcohol, and carbon dioxide. The process of fermentation is again anaerobic and therefore does not require the presence of oxygen. As a result of this lack of oxygen, microorganisms such as yeast bacteria can flourish. Cellular fermentation is often a large part in the food industry, especially in the making of beer, wine, and yogurt. There are two types of fermentation: lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. The first type, lactic acid fermentation, starts with glycolysis, in which glucose is broken down and pyruvic acid is formed. The pyruvic acid is then formed into lactic acid, and carbon dioxide is produced as a byproduct. Lactic acid fermentation is what happens when we make yogurt. Alcoholic fermentation follows a similar process, only the pyruvic acid is converted into 2 molecules of aldehyde. During this reaction, 2 molecules of carbon dioxide are released as waste, and then, by the oxidation of the enzymes NADH to NAD+, 2 molecules of ethanol, or alcohol, are formed. The 2 waste byproducts in this reaction are CO2, and ethanol also acts as a waste product, but these are both easily diffused from the cell. The overall process of fermentation produces far less ATP molecules in respiration and is less efficient as well. However, it is fast and simple alternative to respiration because, unlike respiration, it occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, which requires no other organelles, and respiration occurs in the mitochondria, which is in the center powerhouse of the cell. Additionally, in fermentation, there is no Krebs cycle, no electron transport system, or ATP synthase, so not as much ATP will be made.